Hi, good afternoon to everyone on the East Coast, and I hope everyone coast to coast is having a great day. We are so excited to catch up with this group today on an important topic, success from the start. So welcome to learning about CRO procurement strategies for optimal clinical trial financial management. Thank you again for taking the time today. We have a great panel to discuss this important topic. We are here with our partner, Exilius. We are here with an expert in procurement, Justin Freeman, as well as Katie Falzoni, Jeff Caravella, and Randall Kay, all bringing industry perspectives from accounting, finance, operations, and that clinical lens. We will provide introductions for those team members shortly. To quickly kick off, my name is Jen Cadigan. I'm a partner at Cross Country Consulting. I am in our Boston office, and I lead our life science practice. At a high level, Cross Country is a global firm with offices coast to coast as well as internationally. We focus on supporting our clients through times of growth and change, particularly with a lens towards accounting and finance, transactions, and technology transformation. With me today is Sharon Langen from Exilius, who'd love to talk a little bit more about Exilius.
And welcome everyone. It's great to be here. Thank you to the Cross Country Consulting team. My name is Sharon Langen. I head up partnerships with Exilius. I think if this was an easy subject area, we wouldn't have the turnout that we have today. But based on that, we have a great range of biotech companies joining us. So welcome to you all. I think we can all acknowledge that this topic is very complex and it needs significant alignment between two worlds, two pretty diverse worlds, clinical R&D and finance and accounting. For companies that are sponsoring a trial, financial management is critical. R&D often represents the most material line item. It has high risk exposure. Control around clinical finances is pivotal for a number of things. As you know, managing runway, managing trial success, staying on timelines, and ultimately accurate external reporting. So that's why we're here today. Real quick about Exilius, because I'm more excited to get to the rest of the subject area, but Exilius is a cloud-based FP&A and accounting software. It's purpose-built for the complexity of clinical R&D. So at a high level, by ingesting clinical EDC, trial protocol, and related contractual data, Exilius is automating what has historically been managed in Excel. We're supporting life science companies across the industry, innovators that are out there doing clinical trials. We're helping to support them in managing clinical forecasting, trial budgets, investigator spend estimates and analytics, and R&D accruals within an efficient, financially compliant, and audit-ready framework. So we're excited to be here to talk to this panel and to also hear from all of you. We will do some live polling later. Just a reminder, this is a CPE accredited webinar. So to stay engaged, please make sure you are answering those poll questions. So I just want to do a little plug for that. So next up, you're going to hear from Justin Freeman. As Jen mentioned, Justin is a procurement expert. I know I've learned quite a bit from Justin and really excited to hear from him. And then later on, you'll hear from your industry peers. We'll talk about ways to achieve alignment between diverse stakeholders, how to drive success start to finish with your CRO partnerships, and ensure accuracy and control around your trial forecasts and your R&D accruals. So with that, Justin, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, and before I jump into my presentation, I'll give a brief overview of myself. So I'm a director at Cross Country Consulting. I have roughly 19 years of experience in operational strategy, procurement, and supply chain, mostly all in the consulting space. Over this journey, I've been able to work in pretty much every industry, but I've spent most of it working in life sciences and biotech, helping establish, transform, and optimize finance and procurement functions for companies just like yours, helping solve some of the challenges that we're going to discuss today on our panel. Today, we want to discuss strategies companies are taking to manage all of this through creating better alignment between the medical and finance function, pairing leading technologies like Exilius to help manage clinical spend or end-to-end solutions for source to pay like Coupa to help optimize, reduce bottlenecks, enable end users to do their jobs, putting aside the way that things have been done with a focus on how things could be done, delivering faster results, transparency into cost, and patient results. This probably isn't the first webinar or session you've attended on CROs or this topic in itself. We're all aware of the challenges companies are facing around managing their clinical spend. One of the most important areas is setting a foundation for success that's right from your organization from the start. Having the supplier relationship in place contracts to drive mutually beneficial outcomes with technology to enable the business to focus on user experience. Which leads us to the following discussion with our industry panel of experts who will touch upon their experiences and their view of what best practices are, or better practice, and what's worked for them. So now, without further ado, I hand it over to Jen and Sharon to lead our discussion.
Thank you. With that, would it be helpful for, Katie, if you wanted to provide your intro and a little bit on your company, and Jeff and Randall, and we can jump into some Q&A?
Perfect. Hi, everybody. I'm Katie Falzoni. I'm the corporate controller at Invivid. As part of my role, I do oversee all of the clinical trial accruals and forecasting. Prior to Invivid, I worked at PwC in their life sciences audit practice for over 12 years, really focused on pharma, med device, life science, biotech clients. So about 2.5 years ago, I left PwC. I made the switch to Adagio, which has since been rebranded to Invivid. And Invivid develops monoclonal antibodies for COVID-19. On Monday, we actually announced that we just entered the clinic in our phase 3 trial for the prevention of COVID-19. And we've been busy with the phase 1 trial that we had dosed in Q1, and then the preparations for the phase 3 trial. Prior to our current product, we had another product that unfortunately lost neutralization against the Omicron variant, but we were in phase 3 for those trials. So we've also been winding down those trials over the past couple of years. So we've seen quite the life cycle over the past couple of years, and I'm excited to share all of the learnings that we've had during that time.
Thanks, Katie. I'm gonna go to Jeff next.
Hi, everyone. Jeff Caravella. I'm the Chief Financial Officer of Medicina. It's a company I just recently joined a few weeks ago, responsible for all things related to both finance and accounting operations, as well as all of our investor-related and financing activities. The company itself has really 2 clinical programs right now. One is a program targeting GBM. The company is really focused around an interleukin platform that they've built, and that lead program is in that interleukin space. It's phase 3 enabled, and we're looking currently for potential partnerships or financing that particular trial. Like many in biotech, finding sources of fundraising these days is becoming increasingly difficult. Our second program is in a phase 1 expansion trial for a number of different tumor types that we're working towards right now, both in monotherapy as well as in a dose expansion trial with Pembro, or more commonly known as Keytruda, as a checkpoint inhibitor. And so we're just kicking off those trials now. So nice to meet everyone on the call.
Thanks, Jeff. And welcome to Randall.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Randall Kay. I'm Chief Medical Officer of Longboard Pharmaceuticals. We're a pretty young company. We were a spin out of Arena Pharmaceuticals at the time that Arena was acquired by Pfizer. We represent the neuroscience early stage development that was being conducted at Arena. Our now CFO or now CEO was CFO at Arena and did that spin out. By a quick background, I'm a pediatrician and an immunologist by training. I've been in drug development for about 30 years now. Started off at Pfizer and J&J, and like, wow, this is like really fun and exciting. And then I really saw the light and went to baby biotech and had the opportunity of really being able to dive in and see how medications are really developed and responsible for the sausage making that is typically behind the scenes of drug development. I've been in the CMO position at a number of companies, Avanir, Axsome, Click Therapeutics, and Nirvana. Here at Longboard, we're in mid-stage development in patients with severe refractory epilepsy in phase 2, and we're pretty excited to have an upcoming event of top-line data around the end of this year. So we'll look forward to sharing some insights on how us medical folks think of things and how we best work and partner with our financial colleagues.
Thanks, Randall. And you bring me to what, I wanted to comment is just so unique and admirable about this industry. And, seeing who's here on the line, so many clinical stage biotech companies, in biotech, as you know, finance and accounting, completely different stakeholders than clinical and medical professionals, need to really walk the clinical and organizational journey in lockstep with each other. So that brings us to what we're going to start the panel to kind of talk about that critical translation layer between finance and accounting and the needs of those stakeholders and clinical operations and medical teams that are really driving the trial success. Without effective collaboration between those groups, things start to break down. So I'd like to ask all of the panelists, since you bring diverse perspectives. We have Katie with the accounting and reporting background. We have a CFO, we have a CMO. Maybe, if we can start with Jeff, from a CFO standpoint, in your role, how have you been able to dig into the science and really understand the needs on that side of things? And why is that important for a CFO to be able to articulate internally and externally?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sharon. So interestingly, I'm here as well as Randall at the H.C. Wainwright conference in New York. And I think that probably 95% of the questions that we've gotten from analysts and investors have to do with our science, our clinical design, our enrollment curves, why the indications are that we selected what we're selecting, the design of the trial. So we really have to be prepared to answer those questions. And certainly coming from a background that is not scientifically oriented, it's really important, certainly for me, to stay connected with other members of our team, people like Randall as a CMO, as well as our CRO, in terms of how that trial is going, any updates in terms of patient data, challenges as it relates to enrollment or site activation or investigators. Those are all part of what I consider to be a large part of the role that I have to play too, as we kind of engage with investors and have conversations with them, certainly with the eyes towards raising additional capital for the company. And their eyes are clearly in right now, maybe different than a few years ago, where it was interesting preclinical science would help you raise money. The goalposts have completely shifted towards clinical data and not typically safety data and phase 1 dose escalation. It's meaningful efficacy data. And so that's really what they're keeping their eyes and ears focused in on.
Thanks, Jeff. And Katie, at Invivyd, how have you achieved strong alignment with your clinical ops counterparts?
Yeah, so due to the speed at which we're moving here at Invivyd, and I wouldn't say that this was all very smooth in the beginning, but we've had some growing pains. What we've learned is we really need to have a really close relationship with the ClinOps team. So we really stay connected with them, meeting with them, honestly, multiple times per week. They also kind of know to involve us early in the process. So we're involved in the contracting, et cetera. We work with them to make sure we're sort of establishing clear responsibilities as to who's doing what with the CROs and how that communication flows through the organization. And then even with our first product, we were actually invited to monthly calls with both the ClinOps team and the CRO to go through the financials in the every month. So that was very helpful. We haven't had to do that with our phase 1 yet for the new product, but I do anticipate we'll sort of be crossing that bridge shortly with the new phase 3. And I do find that was very helpful because we were able to establish relationships directly with the people at the CRO and reach out with questions as needed. So I really think it's important to establish, our relationship with ClinOps and really lay the groundwork for what the process will look like from an accounting perspective in terms of monthly reporting, et cetera. And that's what's worked out well for us.
So you set that expectation with the CRO up front that you're going to be acquiring information at a certain cadence, and the expectation that you do want to be able to access them, get on calls, dig in and ask questions when needed.
Exactly. And one of the keys there too is just making sure in the contracting process you put in some kind of clause or otherwise as to when exactly you expect that monthly reporting to come in, whether it's day 3, day 4. That was really helpful for us to be able to go back and point to.
Thanks, Katie. And Randall, sitting in your medical office, overseeing clinical project managers and such. How did you get to learn what an accrual is and what's needed from your team to support that process? Understanding the language of finance. Any tips for success there, or what has worked for you?
Yeah, I got some tips and advice from my CFO colleagues. So everyone will say your CFO is your business partner, which sounds great, but what does that actually mean? And so early on, when I have a CFO will say to me, "Hey, Randall, can I ask you a dumb question?" I'll be like, "Yeah, if we can both agree that I can ask dumb questions and you can ask me dumb questions, and let's not call it that. Just ask. Just help me understand it," because it took me a while to understand that ATM is not a pejorative word, meaning companies don't print money, that ATM means at the market. I thought it just meant companies print money. So realizing that we actually don't understand your common language and going into a discussion, helping us understand it. If you do that for me, I will take any question that you ask. Just reflecting on, today we're attending one of the investor conferences, and I'm pretty sure my CFO can say the exact same thing that I say. She's incredibly adept at the science, and I think that's a great partnership that we can be there. We can support each other, and we can be sort of facilitate either way, and come off it, how we're approaching things together.
Excellent. And Randall, you've been in this industry for a long time, large and small companies. You've seen some of the evolution. We want to talk a little bit more about contracting with CROs. How have you observed things changing in terms of the relationship? And second to that is, how does that evolve and change as a company may grow and scale?
Yeah, so it's an interesting observation over the past, say, 30 years of doing this. The CROs used to do everything. If you were in that stage, starting off at a large company like Pfizer or J&J, they played an important role in doing monitoring of sites, and the rest of the work the medics kind of handled. What I've been seeing is a shift over the last few decades of more and more responsibility going over to the CROs and providing a large variety of services. But things have shifted for some of the small biotechs and the companies that I've been involved in. What's shifting is sometimes we feel that we might be able to do some of this better because we want to have a closer relationship with our customers, with our investigators that are being involved in the studies. And so now that we're partnering with the CRO is starting to come up, where we'll say, why don't we both go to these site initiation visits together? Why don't we kind of do this hand in hand? And then a real interesting wrinkle gradually started to say there are some activities that the CRO is doing that maybe we should start to try to build these things in-house. And so, one last little comment, a challenge that I've had in sort of explaining with my CFO is that a lot of times when we build it in-house, it's not going to save any money. We're not going to be able to do it for less. But what we can often do is come at an approach, whether it's building up internal expertise in drug safety or managing a safety database for the full clinical database. What we end up getting is great institutional memory, building it within our own shop, which often might be the same exact amount of money that we're paying for the CRO, except we think we can get some better quality because we have employees that are have a little more in the game, if you will.
That's a really interesting take. And, a lot of the data out there is showing that, CROs, for lack of a better term, are drinking from a fire hose of business right now. It is shifting. And so I wanted to ask Jeff this next question is, Jeff, you noted at one point in conversations, this increasing reliance on CROs, maybe largely driven to the macroeconomic environment, scarcity of capital. Can you expand a little bit on that? What are you seeing in the real world, and how do you consider that? Outsourcing.
So certainly there's been a lot that's changed, and many folks in this panel on this call have seen it. I think that many companies, including ones that I've participated in, have had to refocus their pipelines down, stopping earlier stage programs, and maybe stopping even clinical trial programs to focus on a more limited set of programs in which they're working on. So why does that matter when it comes to the question with regards to CROs? Is that I think there's a couple of things, and I agree with Randall. I think that there's an element of speed, time that is massively important that you cannot underestimate. So if CROs are taking longer because they are drinking from a fire hose, every day matters. The burn rate, your overhead, it continues whether or not the CRO is able to deliver or not. But at the same time, there's also a huge amount of concerns that have been raised by board members that I've engaged with, investors, about bringing on internal resources, given kind of the variability, given the fact that raising capital is extraordinarily difficult, that we've seen almost 20% of biotechs go away in the last 2 years, on heels of both data and inability to kind of finance the company. So there's no really right answer right now as to how much to engage a CRO versus bringing internal resources on. But as companies have kind of focused their pipeline maybe down to one program in certain cases, does it make sense to kind of build out a full development team? Will they have enough to do? Will there be enough substance there if they're only running, let's say, one phase 1 expansion trial? And so that's also part of the equation where, I've seen from a planning perspective, okay, well, if we bring on an internal development team at 2 or 3 programs, it makes sense. But for one program, let's just rely on a CRO. And if we unlock additional capital through partnerships or equity financing, then yeah, let's build up the next round. Let's restart those programs. But certainly I've seen a heavier reliance more recently on leveraging CROs in a more capital constrained environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and clearly there seems to be, and it's not a one size fits all, but seems to be somewhat of an inflection point as far as, once you have multiple trials, it may be something you do want to bring in.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo Randall. I capability wise, connectivity to the team, I'll choose for an internal person in terms of what I believe most of the time, almost any day of the week, but sometimes the environment just doesn't enable that. To be kind of how or the direction that we go at this point.
So in terms of as organizations scale and grow, as a clinical footprint may expand, Jeff, another question for you is, how should companies think about timing related issues when contracting with a CRO? Maybe you're a non-accelerated filer today, maybe you won't be tomorrow. What are some of the things that CFOs, corporate controllers, and their clinical counterparts should think about embedding or building into agreements with the CRO to not just ensure success today as the company and organization looks, but vision for the future as the company grows and scales?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. Katie touched a little bit on this as it relates to the timing and some of the deliverables. I think sometimes scoping those out early during the contracting process, and not just at a high level, sometimes actually seeing the types of schedules, working through and iterating what those schedules can look like from the close perspective is something that I've oftentimes found successful to include as an appendix, for example, in some of the contracts. So you really know up front what the deliverables are, and there's some level of alignment there, especially as we just talked about. If you're using these as really extensions of your team, it has to work. You have to have a true partnership with them in ways that are not just on the scientific, medical, clinical side, right? But also on the financial side. And I've certainly seen some of the CROs have built out quite robust, finance teams that are able to assist on this. And I think you brought up the other point, Sharon, which is, thinking about the future needs of some of these timing related things, where if you say, hey, we need this within 10 days, but if you're fortunate enough to, be in a different situation where you do kind of take step changes from an organizational market cap filer status side, making the contract flexible enough that it's able to adapt so that those deliverables might be earlier. And then certainly I think that thinking about the scale and scope of the number of trials. So, sometimes as you kind of think ahead, ways in which to negotiate add-ons from a trial perspective. So if you're doing a second or third trial with them, I sometimes start to prime that pump early as to, okay, what kind of cost advantages might be able to take advantage of if we use that CRO for trials 2 and 3, for example.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jeff. We're going to soon move on to forecast accuracy, talk a little bit about clinical trial financial management. But before that, Justin, if you have some closing pearls of wisdom from a procurement standpoint, as companies think through their partnerships with the CRO, begin negotiating these agreements, what are some closing thoughts on that topic?
I think our panel's covered it pretty well. I mean, it all starts with the contract. I mean, the contract's really your job description for your CRO and what you're going to manage them to. So just as you want to have people internally and bring them internal, we have expectations of what they're going to do during their day-to-day activities. And having that, prescriptive, descriptive contract with what the CRO is responsible for, how they're going to do it, and how they're going to be measured up front really sets the foundation for success. And I think a lot of companies rush to getting through the contracting process and lack transparency into what they really want from their CROs. And I think it's about working together to set the expectations, set the description of what you want to do, and build out that job description for your CRO so that you can manage them throughout the process and look as to them as team members versus just, a company you're doing business with.
All right. So I think, Jen, we'll now switch gears over to forecast accuracy. I think you're on mute, Jen.
All I was going to say is before we get into that topic, we just want to launch that first polling question. So, the question for the group really is, and I guess we're benefiting all the late joiners to still get their CPE credits with the polling question starting half past. But when selecting your CRO, what is most important? So we're looking at vendor capabilities, price, timeline, or legacy relationships. So I'll just give everyone a few seconds to cast their vote so we can sort of look at those results and talk a little bit more about the world that I live in, as long as Jeff and Katie with the accounting and finance lens on things. So I guess while we're waiting for those results, Jeff, my first question is really going to be for you as a CFO. Today's market conditions are drastically different than a few years back, and I know we're all feeling it. So from a CFO perspective, would love to talk a little bit about how important you're viewing forecast accuracy, specifically when it comes to the cash runway, effective trial management in today's market. Themes like ensuring your timelines are reasonable and perhaps not overly optimistic to make sure that there can be delivery on them. I'd love to learn more about your approach to that.
Yeah, it's very relevant. I think I've had probably 6 conversations today about timelines, cost, runway, et cetera. So it's extremely important. I mean, the hand waving approach of saying like, this is how much it's going to cost for the trial and this is what your cash runway is just wholly insufficient. And so certainly as I've kind of come in here to medicine, it's an area where I'm tackling kind of head on as it relates to kind of the level of depth associated with the cash runway analysis and the trials and when things are actually going to happen. And I think that there's a blend here is, certainly there's many companies that will under deliver as it relates to the forecast, and they'll spend less because the timelines take longer. That's not really a great thing either. So underspending is not always a very good thing. At the same time, I was talking with one of the sell side analysts today, is the companies that always put forward estimates from a spend perspective are super aggressive, and then have these very conservative enrollment timelines and then beat over and over and over again. Also, there's a bit of credibility issues when you do that as well. So I think it's really important to really spend the time kind of thinking through the balance of that 50% case, like 50% I can beat it, 50% I don't, so that it's a bit more of a balanced perspective on the forecast. And certainly I'm going through this right now where we're in the midst of hiring a CMO for the organization with different thoughts, and certainly Randall can comment to this as well, but a trial design, and there's multiple ways to kind of proverbial skin that cat, and so each one of these come with different timelines, different cost, different implications as to the when that data can get read out and to what extent it can, and all of these come with different profiles that relate to the financing of the company, to the cash burn, etc. So having multiple options and multiple ways to look at forecast scenarios, I think, is also a really important part of the equation as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, Jeff. And I do have some questions for Katie, but we can pause for a minute to kind of digest these polling questions. So when selecting your CRO, what's most important? Vendor capabilities. I'm certainly not surprised, actually, by that result. My surprise is I thought legacy relationships might have actually held a little stronger, but maybe that's buried in vendor capabilities. Any reactions from the panel? Surprises here? Or does this really resonate before we continue with some of our planned questions? Oh, Randall.
I'm surprised that our relationships didn't pop higher, but when I think about it, it shouldn't. When I'm talking with my CFO counterpart and we're talking about different CROs to bring in, absolutely 100%, it's based on previous relationships. Of the 3 to 5 that are going to come in to do a capabilities and subsequent bid defense. After that, the poll totally makes sense from my experience. It's all about what capabilities they bring. Maybe more importantly, what team they're bringing in on these presentations. Because I heard one comment made by Jeff earlier about how the CRO is an extension of your team. So you better be interviewing them like you would your head of ClinOps or your CRAs, because they are an extension of your team, do or die.
Well, thank you for that. I guess with that, kind of continuing on the forecast accuracy and trial performance, Katie, question for you. What are some of the challenges with the status quo, from an FP&A perspective, from an accounting standpoint, dealing with the speed of progress, talent turnover, highly manual processes? I'd love to learn in your experience, some of the challenges you faced.
Yeah, so from a forecasting perspective, it's been challenging for us just due to the speed at which we're moving and all the changes that occur. We feel like we're constantly rebudgeting and reforecasting, not quarterly, not annually, but monthly or multiple times a month sometimes. And so as Jeff mentioned earlier, there's also a big question of when do you bring in an internal resource to handle that versus when are you outsourcing it? And the same is true from a finance perspective. And, obviously biotech is resource constrained. We've had turnover in talent. Unfortunately, we had a RIF back in 2022. We did lose an internal resource who was actually responsible for the clinical forecasting and accounting. And as a result, we had a difficult transition period. At the time, we had a really highly manual process in Excel, which I think is consistent with most people or most companies. And so we had to transition not only the accounting piece, but also the forecasting piece. And it was a big question. Okay, where does all of this information live, right? Like we work closely with ClinOps. It's a collaborative effort to come up, especially with the forecast. But how do we make sure that going forward, there's one place that everybody can access it and it's something that is easily transitioned from one person to another? And then the other question is, because of resource constraints, also, we kind of need the same level of resources to be able to do more. So we actually ended up bringing on Auxilius at the tail end of last year. We've been using them for an accounting perspective during this year. We will, now that our protocol is stabilizing, we'll also be starting to use Auxilius from a forecasting perspective for our phase 3 trial going forward. But really, I think it's freed up some of our resources, time, and our staff to work on other areas and to elevate their roles and become really the reviewer versus the preparer of those accruals. So for us, it's really been great to have one repository that both ClinOps and finance can access, and really to leverage the knowledge and the help that Auxilius can provide, for us to be able to utilize our current resources, which is a lean team, in order to work on other areas as they pop up.
Thank you so much for that, Katie. I will launch the second polling question and maybe kind of dive in a little bit more to some of the stuff that you just talked about, Katie. But first, for poll number 2 is really, what is your biggest headache in clinical trial financial management? So themes are R&D forecasting, vendor accountability, clinical trial accruals, and resource constraints. And Katie, honestly, on theme of the improvements that you've noted in your team, as well as maybe how those improvements tie to headaches, I'd love for you to maybe kind of speak to your view on the poll, or dive in a little bit more to some of the improvements that you talked about while people answer.
Sure. So, I think the main thing there is really just the fact that we are now leveraging a new process. I think it was really helpful to actually dive into the process too, as we transition from this manual Excel model into a more automated model. We really had to dive into what is the existing process, why are we doing it this way, and come up with improvements as we put it into Auxilius. And then from there, we've been able to really shift things around between different team members, which I think has been great for the various team members to see different areas of the close. And then with multiple leaves, et cetera, over the past year, we've been able to more easily transition that area among different members of the team. So happy to answer any further questions you guys have on that.
Thank you so much. It almost is even. I feel like we thought all of these were pain points, and I guess any reactions from the panel on these questions? Otherwise, I'd love to pass it over to Sharon and Randall to dive in a little more.
Yeah, I think in some ways this is kind of representative of who's dialed into today's webinar. If you're a CFO, I think cash runway is probably top of your list. If you're a corporate controller, or you're doing SEC reporting, that clinical trial accrual is going to probably be your big headache. So I think maybe that's why we're seeing that split here. But suffice to say, this can be a hairball. There's a lot of headaches end to end with this process. So thank you all for jumping in with the poll. And
I think
Katie,
there should have been a all of the above, Sharon. I think it would have been like 100% there probably.
I think so. Yeah. The odds would have been in that favor. Absolutely. So, we've talked about finance and accounting, forecasting accuracy, collaboration internally. I would love to ask you, Randall, in terms of how maybe it's apply pressure. What approach do you take to make sure you're getting the most out of your CRO? So, sure, internally you're aligning with finance and accounting. There's ways in which financial management of clinical trials can be streamlined, can be improved for accuracy. How do you get the most out of your CRO though? That's, that third-party relationship to make sure you're getting the performance you need.
So you would think when we started working with CROs, the purpose of working with them was to not have any headaches, almost without a pun, prophylactic. And then the question that you asked touches upon what are the headaches, and you get this big list. So there are headaches, there are challenges, and there's a tremendous amount of work that we're putting on the CROs and hoping that they're going to perform. So I can tell you what I've been doing career-wise, and what we do at Longboard is as we're starting to work with them, we are extraordinarily hands-on. We do not make any assumption that we sign the contract and I'm just there as the medical guy in case there's a safety issue that comes up, and that I get to review the final data set when we're getting top line results. It's an ongoing relationship. What works for us is that we feel very much that the CRO is an extension of us, not the other way around, that they work for us for the benefit of the clinical trial sites. And what that looks like is very frequent communication interaction. It means when there's a site visit to a clinic, to one of our sites, we actually go with them. We're partnering together. We never want to have a clinical trial site say the PPD study or the Cineo study. And that's not negative on them. It's more like it should be the Longboard study or it should be the Pacific study, never about the third party vendor that we're working with. We do have a rule on when we're on Zoom calls that everyone has to show their face so that people aren't allowed to multitask. But it's more kind of like we try to really encourage and engage them as close as we can, and that's from the very very beginning all the way through to top line results.
And getting site data from your CRO in a timely fashion at a granular level, is that something that you've had success with? That could be a data lag issue.
It is. When you're first sitting there with your CFO and you're hearing a bid defense and everything sounds all really like wonderful and great, and then you start your study 6 to 12 months later, and half the team's not quite there anymore, which is not a surprise. That's sort of what you expect. So right from the very, very beginning, we're trying to set expectations. We will put KPIs in place as appropriate, but they have to go beyond site activation numbers and how they're going to progress and what are enrollment. They have to be KPIs that actually make sense, that are giving early reads of how well the study is going, and then to make changes along the way.
Thank you, Randall. Well, we have a couple of poll questions, which we want to tee up our third one here. So in terms of what you all in the audience have experienced, actual versus what was actual trial costs in aggregate compared to those initial budgets and projections, what has your experience been? Are you often seeing it's 10 to 20% over budget, over 20, or greater than 30% over budget, or maybe there's some lucky trial sponsors out there that are right on target? Question, I don't know if the panel has anything any experience here. I know, Jeff, you mentioned earlier, sometimes it's not always good to come in under budget in a period when it's really a timeline issue, and in aggregate you end up spending more than you planned.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that in some ways those poll questions could be, greater than 10% or less than 10%, because there's kind of the boundary conditions. If you go in and say, hey, my spending is 30% below, they're going to say, okay, well, tell me, whether it's investors, whether it's your board, tell me why that is. Like, did something not happen, or are you really bad at forecasting? So neither one really kind of puts you in a great position, because it is almost like a bit of a flag, and you've got kind of the red light blinking on like what's going on here. So I do think that there's, somewhere in the less than 10% range would be kind of what I was shooting for in a biotech. When you start to get above that, I think I would be a bit frustrated, in the position I'm in, if we're kind of on either end of the greater than 10% or minus than 10%, right? So.
And more than half are seeing greater than 20% over budget. Okay. Interesting. Okay. And our last poll question, what's driving some of that change? If we can pull that up. Are these cost deviations driven primarily by maybe site costs, or out of line with the initial budget? What you might be paying at Dana-Farber is going to be a lot different than what you would be paying at a rural hospital or health system, or is it timeline driven? We should have a combination of both, as that's often what we see. Justin, from your vantage point, working with your clients, do you see one or the other, more site costs being the driver of deviation from initial budget projections, or is it a timeline issue where the trial's just taking longer?
I think it goes beyond that. I mean, it can be patient ads, it could be a site ad, it could be delays, there could be increased costs because of inflation or challenges in supply chain, which we all experienced over the COVID period where people just jacked up pricing on everything and said it was a supply chain issue. So now I think we're kind of recalibrating and coming back to where we're at, but and that's why I think it comes back to one of the key points that everyone brought up is the contract and having those things built into the contract up front so that, you know, at the end of the day, you're not paying more for inflation than say they're going to charge you 10% more because of inflation or supply chain issues. So having those key things built into the contract, just as Randall mentioned, KPIs and SLAs, so that you have it agreed up front. And if something comes up and there is some inflationary issues, you have indices or some measurement that you can go back to negotiate with your CRO.
Yeah.
Not entirely surprising, pretty split.
Yeah, pretty split.
Well, we have a few Q&A, and audience members, please feel free to type in your questions here. We did receive a question ahead of time that we'll touch on in the question related to if the panel could share some best practices with respect to inflation or foreign currency adjustments. You know, one of the things I would say, and I'll open up the panel to opine on this as well. And Justin, as you just said, is negotiating the inflation clause up front. And, you know, if it's a global study, you might want to consider if you tie that to the US CPI, if you are running a global study where labor rates aren't really in line with that. As to foreign currency exchange, you know, one thing we would recommend is documenting the exchange rates used in the contract. That's really important, as well as having the CRO do a quarterly analysis, requesting that, looking at the last quarter's invoices at contract rate versus what they would be at a spot rate, which would be specified the source of the spot rate within the agreement or the MSA. If there is a difference, defining, you know, what triggers an actual invoice issued via credit memo or new invoice being raised. But I think a lot of that is making sure that your CRO is doing that analysis, typically asking for that within 30 days after quarter close. Panel, any thoughts on that? Foreign currency adjustments, how to deal with that with your CRO, or inflation adjustments?
I would just say that some of the things you've mentioned already, Sharon, are what I would consider to be reasonable and something I'd look for in a contract. And I think that sometimes having somewhat of collars on either end, you don't want to be doing it for minor changes. It can be administratively burdensome on both sides to do that if it's not really worth it. And so typically we would try to put something, boundary conditions on plus or minus that seem to be reasonable and worth it, so that it was something that we would monitor, but it wasn't necessarily a requirement to do every single time that we had an invoice.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we've got some more questions coming in. I guess this might actually be best for Katie because it relates to some accruals, but definitely happy for the rest of the panel to chime in. What is the best practice on accruing investigator grants? But obviously definitely happy for anyone on the panel to be able to chime in for that.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult one. We typically, you know, I would say usually follow sort of the patient enrollment curve. But obviously that's sort of what we look to first. But there are multiple different items that we sort of take into consideration, but generally we'll definitely compare the enrollment to where our accruals every period.
And I would say, as a former auditor and spending 12 years testing those types of accruals, I think it's always about that comparative of third-party data. What is your estimate? And, you know, comparing all of those to get to kind of what you think that right answer is. So.
Right, exactly. And to the extent you can really use third-party data like EDC data, et cetera, and then data from the CRO and sort of triangulate all of that to get to what your accrual should be is sort of best practice from our perspective.
Yeah, I would echo that, Katie. Just triangulating, we really think it's important to have an evidence-based view of what your investigator accrual is. Using sort of a bottoms-up per patient build can be really the difference between, a material swing either way. We very much think it's important to look at the vendor estimate, have your own view of the world, but have an evidence-based view as well to be able to compare against.
Excellent. Just kind of looking at some of the other questions that came in as people registered. And I don't know, Justin, if this maybe is more in your wheelhouse, but we obviously like the whole panel to comment. There was a team member who was asking if they could understand what PDP platforms and CROs mostly utilize. And they were also looking for some best practices in terms of setting up POs for CROs. So is it a payment schedule based? Is it a bucket based PO? Would definitely love to hear accounting, finance, Justin, Randall's view on it if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, from the platform side of things, I mean, it depends on what the CROs are trying to do. I mean, typically the P2P platform sits within the company, the sponsor on their side of things. You go through the growth period, you select your ERP, you put in place a P2P system like a Coupa, and then you use like an Auxilius to manage your clinical spend. And that typically sits on the sponsor side versus the CRO side. I have seen instances where you can kind of share in that, but mostly on the business side.
Thank you. Can pause to see if the audience has a few more questions. There's one kind of theme that I'd love to highlight given the panel that we have today between accounting, finance, clinical. And Randall, you actually spoke to it a little bit earlier in one of your answers, but if I was to kind of think about like how finance could best position themselves to work and add value for the R&D organization, is there any last like tips and tricks that the panel would like to add, and perhaps even the inverse of that? If there's anything that finance always looks at as best practices from their clinical team.
Sure. I mean, I don't have our clinical team here to comment, but what we've tried to do from a finance side is sort of speak their language to the extent possible. And to the extent we start building up the numbers at the end of any quarter, we like to present it in a way that sort of follows the business and in a way that they can easily understand. So for example, we would build up by vendor, sort of by contract, what are the total costs? How much have we accrued from a percentage standpoint? How much has been invoiced, et cetera. So we try to really wrap it up in a little bow for them to be able to see this is a snapshot of where we're at, and they can just sort of step back and say, does this make sense to me based on where the clinical trial stands? I think that's been really helpful and just the most efficient use of their time, and has enabled us to have a good partnership with the ClinOps team.
If I can add, sometimes because the finance is not a common language for us medical folks, when you guys are asking a question, or you're trying to get some insight into forecasting or what are the trial expectations, it helps for us to understand what the underlying real question is. If you're trying to put together final year-end numbers, let us know that's what the goal is. Sometimes when you're focusing on sort of one area, we're not sure exactly what you're looking for, and it's perfectly fine to step back and give us a little bit more of a picture of like why it's important, what the context is of it, just because it's unlikely we're going to get that you're just trying to figure out whether or not you should be shifting that budget into next year, or whether it's going to be spent this year. You're not questioning whether we understand our job. Of course we understand, of course we know that, but sometimes just a little extra information will help us give you a more helpful answer.
Yeah, Jim, one thing I would add to that, that one of what we see across a lot of companies is, finance and accounting, if they have the right view of the data across the trial from that financial standpoint, being able to see enrollment, what's happening at the site level and time level, understanding drivers of change, finance and accounting may well find themselves positioned to inform their ClinOps counterparts on trends or it may be issues before ClinOps may realize it, because if finance is tracking what's happening at that granular level, understanding what those drivers of change are, I believe, and what we've seen is finance is in a place of empowering their clinical counterparts to go dig into that with the CRO from that project management standpoint. So I think that's an area of adding value.
Absolutely. I'm happy to kind of keep the Q&A open a little bit longer for the audience and keep it running for those who are trying to get CPE. So maybe quickly on the admin side of things, for those of you who tuned in and are also seeking some CPE as part of this webinar, you will get a certificate of completion within about 5 business days. If not, there's an email here, training@crosscountryconsulting.com, and we will be able to make sure that you get that certificate. So thank you again for joining us today. It actually looks like I'm going to pause before the happy hour invite. We got one other question. Should finance members be involved in the CRO contract negotiation? I guess I'd love to hear the panel's view on that. I think the answer is yes, but I'd love to hear some good stories to support that. So maybe Jeff or Justin, I think some of the stories you shared earlier probably align with that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll let Jeff go, but I think Katie mentioned it before, is it's being involved early and upfront in the process and having finance built into that process. And then I'll let Jeff go because I know he's about to speak too.
Absolutely. I think that there's, times where they're not involved, and they've got to be, involved in ways that are helpful and constructive, not just impediments or kind of throwing obstacles up, right? So looking at solutions, but I think it is, something that's difficult to kind of put things back in the bag once that contract is close to final, to then try to bring up some of the points that we've made today. So I do think it's, from my perspective, it's an expectation I set with the management team that are doing these, that it's really important to have someone on the finance team involved early.
Just to add to that, we're involved in preparing for our CROs that we'll be utilizing next year. Our CFO to that level was intimately involved in the initial presentations by the capability presentations by our CRO. But when I think about the current ongoing study that we're involved in, our weekly meetings always include a colleague from finance, because you're right, Sharon, you brought this up. Sometimes they're going to pick up like, did you notice that we've been getting we're exceeding the expectations for billing for this kind of a service? And like, oh, that's really, really important, because that's given us a little bit of a hint. So we keep them involved throughout, and way beyond just how are we doing to budget. We really consider them a strategic partner, as we're intimately involved in our clinical trials.
And a lot of it comes down to process as well. So if accounting is not involved early on in the process and not involved in contracting, then you could be getting invoices every other day from your CRO because they built that into the contract. And operationally, that's not awesome for finance to have to process an invoice every day with the CROs. And what terms are those invoices on, and the POs and payment terms and things like that. And those are all things, like I mentioned before, it's setting the foundation and having things right and thinking of how it's going to affect the business operationally on the back end, and how is finance going to handle that relationship, and accounting for what's being spent with the CROs, how it's being spent, and what buckets it's going into.
Thank you all so much. We're happy to keep this quite open in case there's additional Q&A for the group as we come up to the end of the hour. But for those who are in the New England area or Massachusetts based and interested in kind of continuing the conversation, the majority of people who are on the panel today are going to be in Boston for a life science conference next week, and would love to mix and mingle over some snacks and conversation at a happy hour on Tuesday the 19th. So no need to be at the conference to join, but if you'd like to continue the conversation or just catch up in general, we don't need to have the sci-fi convo going on there, but would love to see you, and really looking forward to continuing more of these with this group here. So thank you all.
Thank you.
That was fun.